But yeah, here we are. We've got some members of the plot team live for you to answer your questions. I'm Dave Kibblewhite. I run the plot team as of halfway through last year. And I've got with me the indomitable Cat Quatermass, the ever fabulous Rena Robson, the wily Steve Kirkbride, and the sassy yet understated Emma Round. Yeah, I thought we'd start off with a pretty basic question that was asked on the forum. We were asked, what does a plot writer actually do? So I'll just give my answer quickly, which is that the answer is quite a lot, actually, because cover quickly what we don't do, which is decide where the barbarian armies go, or like the overall direction of the campaign in that sense. So what might happen is the game team will decide, say, that the Druze are invading, I don't know, let's say Urizen, and they will work out all the consequences of that. But then they might come to the plot team and say, well, the Druze have invaded Urizen, so let's come up with some stories about how that would actually affect people, and we'll then put those out onto the field and try to make those campaign decisions turn from writing into actual action on the field, and that reverberates around. And yeah, so to answer what we actually do, a lot, because we write all of those stories, and then we also, perhaps in conjunction with a great deal of other crew members, we'll have to organise happen on the field. So making sure people are cast and they have clothes and they have props and they have ribbons and all of that stuff. But I'd like to, I don't want to take all these questions myself. I've got a team of people here who I would like to pass things around to. So you want to take a swing at that question, Kat?
Yes. For me, I think it's really different for different plot writers. We all work in relatively different ways, and the way plot is run at Empire, there's a reasonable amount of flexibility to do that. But there are a couple of things that we absolutely don't do. One is have creative control. It is a system that is editorially controlled for the top. So it is like writing plot for a magazine, where Matt and Andy are your magazine editors. So your ideas, your way of wanting to do things have to go through that editorial space. And I think that's an exciting thing about it, but I think it's a challenging thing about it for lots of people. After that, we do an awful lot of administration to make sure there is enough information about the plot that we're trying to do that refs and players and all those other teams that Dave mentioned know what on earth is going on. You can try to streamline that back. And in the early years, there were more streamlined versions where people didn't write quite as much. And what would consistently happen is a player would go to a ref and ask about something, and the ref would not have a way of finding out what was going on. So we do a lot of tying things together and matching them up. And then the last bit for me is experience design. I don't do plot writing to write stories. I do plot writing to design experiences. And I also never have my own ideas for stories. What I do is I go, I want to make this kind of thing happen in this kind of space. Andy, which Eternal should I use? But that's pretty specific to me. Most of the rest of them do a lot more of their own actual ideas than that. That's it.
I can go next if you like.
Yeah, well, we probably don't have to super take turns. I thought Kat might like to start on that one.
So I guess I'm going to answer that question in a different way by sort of describing what my average event would be like as a plot writer, because I think Dave and Kat are giving you a lot of kind of information, and I kind of want to just put that in the context of when you're on the field preparing to time in as a player, what are we doing as plot writers? So, you know, normally, ideally, I like to be there on a Thursday, though that's not always the case. Sometimes I arrive on a Friday. I'll bring my field laptop, which is a battered old thing that is going to die at some point due to dust, but that's okay. I'll find somewhere to plug it in, and then I'll look at the list of plots that I'm intending to run over the weekend that I will have had previous meetings with Andy and Matt to discuss and develop. They should be at a point when they're ready to go. Inevitably, this is not the case. I will not have written some stuff there'll be some plots where there's big TBDs everywhere, or some document that I desperately need to write, and it's almost time in, and oh goodness, it's not written. So then I'll start to, incidentally, this applies to all plot writers, including Andy Raff. So it needs, especially Andy Raff. Much love to him. So like there's this big race of just trying to pull strands together and make sure you've got last minute stuff and go, oh, how I sorted that prop. And some, I mean, Kat's amazing. She can do it a lot in advance. I'm not very good at it. So there's lots of going, oh, I need the exact prop for this, or making sure that you're going to have the person cast for this thing, making sure stuff is timetabled in properly. All of this kind of thing. So that's kind of racing towards the Friday. Now, I'll probably make myself a timetable for when I've got to be where. Often I do some NPCing work, so I'll make sure that's slotted in. And basically, by about midday or getting on for past midday on Friday, I want to know what my weekend is going to look like pretty much definitively. Ideally, I'd know that earlier, but that never happened. So then we go into the actual event and time in, and pretty much every plot. So any particular plot, if it's a field plot, which is when you're encountering NPCs on the field, which I think is what most people think of as like bread and butter plot. We do a lot of other stuff. You know what it will be. There's a scheduled encounter about an hour before. I'll need to be in the plot tent. I'll find my NPCs. I'll brief them. I'll talk to them about it. They can access on the plot wiki or some other resource what I've written about it. But often there's stuff that's easier to communicate. Stuff about at this stage, what we are like as plot writers are actually more like directors, and that's kind of how I think about it. The NPCs are the people interpreting your work, and they do a lot of the creative work in that themselves. And without our amazing NPCs, we couldn't do what we do. And you're the kind of director going, oh, these are my kind of notes on how you want to play this. Because I don't really see my NPCs once they go out. So after the hour at the scheduled time, and maybe they're meeting a player, maybe there's an encounter tent. There's lots of different ways you could do it. I'll sort of push them out or wave them off, and then they'll time in. And then I kind of just have to hope it works. And then after some time, hopefully they come back and they'll debrief to me either via a written form, or sometimes, again, I like to just talk to it in person. And I get an idea about how stuff went, where the players gone, how the players felt, where we think stuff's going. I'll make some brief notes about any follow-up that might need to happen. And then, I'm probably already thinking about the next thing when we're going on to that. There's often not much chance to follow up on a thing during an event, and often it doesn't make sense in the context of the world, but sometimes this is the case. And that will often involve me having to have a chat to someone like Andy or Matt as to work out how we're going to do that. And so most of my weekend is filled with things, with cycles like that. There's also a bunch of, if in a dry moment, what I'll often be doing is I quite like to do little odd jobs and stuff. So, if, for instance, Andy has had something or Matt's had something that needs a bit more, some emergencies come up and one of the fields is flooded or something. Matt was going to run this plot, but now someone else do it. Then often you need a plot writer to just take that on and get out as well. I mean, actually, it's one of the good things about having Dave now is that we've got someone kind of centrally whose job it is to manage that kind of stuff. But it's very much the kind of job I enjoy doing too. And then we kind of get towards the end on a Sunday. Often we don't run tons of plot on a Sunday, and that's just because there's not loads of time on it outside of the battle time. Although we do try to run some stuff out. We do run plot during battles, and but also the key thing that I need to make sure I do on a Sunday is write the stuff down that I'm thinking, because I have a terrible memory. I just don't remember anything. And so if I have an idea in a field, I'll probably a few weeks later when I come to write it up, I just have no idea what it was. So my critical job before I leave a field on a Sunday is getting down my brain state as much as I can, so that when I come to work out what's next, I can actually refer to that. So that's my diary of a plot writer.
Thank you, Renner. Does Emma or Steve have much to add, or shall I move on to another question?
I function a lot like Kat does, actually. I create experiences. I try and think of things that would enhance the game for the player base. We'll build off what they've fed back to us through Senate motions, through Synod judgments, through things they've put in their in-character newspapers, and what my NPCs have fed back to me from previous sessions. And then I just try and think what would be cool and how can I get my players to that in an interesting way.
I'm the same. I'm more of a Renner type than the others, but yeah.
I like to think of us as agents of chaos.
I know what I said.
Okay, right. So Here's a question then. If some of the incidental detail of a piece of player background shouts to a piece of player plot, what would be the way to make the plot team aware?
Sorry, but you said player plot.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what's meant by that, but I assume they basically mean if something is going out, something that they find out that is going on the field. They may not mean player plot. They mean plot, I guess.
Sure. Okay. So just to clarify, I mean, maybe I'm not the first to answer this, but the question is, you know, we are running some plot about apple wizards in Weirwater, and it turns out someone's backstory is that they're an apple wizard, and then they're like, well, how do I make sure the plot team have realized that I'm an apple wizard?
I think that's basically the question. Yeah, how do the plot team know about my background? Let's talk about that in a more general sense, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, in Rena's example, if I had sent that out as a member of plot, hopefully the players would have engaged with my NPCs that were out on the field and said, hey, I'm an apple wizard too. How come, I've not heard of this? Tell me about this. My NPC, when they come back to debrief me or let me know that there is an apple wizard on the field, hopefully said apple wizard has given the NPC their name, and the NPC has written it down and spelt it correctly, or at least has a good memory for it.
Really
and then yeah, and then I can go into, I can bring up the system and I can have a look at that player's background, and maybe I might put some minor tweaks into it, have the NPC them go out and react slightly differently to them or try and make it a bit more special. Of course, that's a bit harder if it's something more generic, like you're fighters, I've held a sword too, when it comes to the other way, if you're like, why is nothing coming out of my background? Like, there are thousands, I think probably tens of thousands of backgrounds on the database, and not one of us has read them all. And we tend to search looking for keywords through them. And if your background doesn't have sort of keywords in it, like, I want to do a heresy, or my character wants to start a cult, or I'm a criminal, then sadly there's a good chance that it just won't get noticed.
I think, Kat, you had a good point about this.
Yeah, so there's a thing, because I come from some of the very old school 90s festivals where you used to write your group background, and then your group would run your own little thing going on to find out things about that group background, and your faction might decide to adopt it as the faction background, and then they would run things with it. And in some of those, you could even pay to have linears run that matched your backgrounds. Empire just doesn't do any of that stuff at all. It's a player-led world in the sense it's player-led by the way you respond to things that happen on the field. It's not player-led in the sense of you can create a background that we will incorporate into the world. That's how we build the world. Having said that, it does happen sometimes. If a writer is interested in it, let's stick with our apple wizards. If a writer is interested in apple wizards, at least 50% of us will search the backgrounds for the apple wizard tag first, and we'll try and give you a heads up. That might turn up in a letter in your pack. It might turn up in a nudge from your egregore. It might turn up in the NPC having you on a list of people they're trying to look for in the field. But it won't necessarily play out the way you were hoping it would. If you have a thing in your background where your village was wiped out, we won't necessarily give you an option to go and, let's say your village was wiped out and you left something important behind. You might never see an option to go and find that important thing that was left behind. You might see something else that happened to relate to the people who wiped the village out come in a different direction. You can't control, and you can't ask to control how we respond to what you put in there.
And that kind of matches to a degree with, because I mean, I agree, and I think there's some subtle tips about how to write a useful background that still feels authentic and that's about your character. No one wants to just have bullet points are good, but no one wants just a shopping list. Write it about your character, but also think about, if I showed this background to someone who knew nothing else about me, what I like as a player, what about this character other than what's in this background box? Would someone understand this character? And actually that touches on a thing. So Kat and Emma were talking about experiences, and I quite like experiences, but I would say my driving force as a plot writer is emotions. I want people and the characters they play to feel things, and so I like themes. If there are themes and resonances that exist in your background, and those are reified by attaching to the strata, like the elements of the world that we've defined as PD. So you say, oh, something about the Grendel or something about this, and so we can find them when we search. So if you tell me about the Grendel and tell me about how your character feels about the Grendel, well, that's clearly if I find that and notice it, maybe there's a chance I can hook you into it. As Kat said, if you say the Grendel stole this specific thing from me and it's on this specific island, we're not saying that's not true. If you put something in your background and it's entirely plausible to be true within the thing of the world, then we're not saying it's didn't happen or it's false. But in terms of will it be followed up with plot, less so. I mean, sometimes people get that kind of plot from player events, but that's a different thing. And certainly it doesn't really happen in sort of the mainstream Empire. But if from your background, I understand how your character would react to a variety of different events, maybe not even the ones that they mention in their background explicitly, those are the most useful kinds of backgrounds to me, because those are the ones that tell me as a plot writer what you will take from a plot. And it's nice for me to be able to have an idea about that before stuff rolls out, especially if there's plot which is more focused at particular people as opposed to broadband stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I'll say sometimes I like to subvert what's in the background as well. So if it says like my parents disappeared because they were taken as slaves or something, then I might potentially write a plot where actually their parents disappeared because they're a secret agent or something like that. Just potentially. So.
But you wouldn't contradict the known facts, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
No, that's right. No.
Yeah, it would be part of their cover that they'd been taken by slaves.
Yeah,
So
that kind of thing.
So that your story would still be consistent. We'd just be throwing something else at you.
Okay, questions just come in from chat. It's a bit of a sort of technical question, but I think it's worth answering. There's probably a few different ways of answering this. They say, apart from egregores, how many other NPCs do you roughly have in plot / on field per event? That's from Dredgeski76.
So it's probably worth mentioning that egregores and the civil service and the members of the Three Rings, and I am probably forgetting at least one other group of people, for which I'm very sorry, are not technically part of plot. They're part of what do we call them now? Claire's team. And although we work very closely with them, it's not like when we say NPCs, that's generally not what we're talking about. Dave, you were an egregore, so actually probably you can say the most sensible stuff about this.
Yeah, I mean the field NPC team is run by, as you say, Claire, who runs player support, and that covers, yeah, like you say, the civil service, egregores, and the Three Refrains. They are NPCs, of course, and they can be directed by plot writers potentially to be NPCs in our plots. It's just that they are permanently on the field and they have like permanent jobs that they do. And
are playing consistent characters. So I couldn't. Although they're performing a function, they're playing characters, so it's harder to use them in plots in the sense I can't write them as an entire person, but I can sort of feed stuff in via them.
But they are an interesting point that relates to a follow-up question we've had on the backgrounds thing that I'm seeing come through the channel, which is that there are a ton of in-field methods for in-character letting people you're in aware of things, and your civil servants and your egregores are one of those. We have a meeting with them every morning of the event, and literally you tell them, they'll take down your group name and they'll come to us and they say, this group is really interested in this plot on the field. Can we have some more that focuses that, or what should I be suggesting to them that they do next? So we have a mechanism to use those field NPCs to help you get involved. I will, before we go back to the characters question, I'll roughly list the other mechanisms. Use synod declarations. The things that you say in synod declarations tell us what you care about. Use Coldwing messengers to named people with addresses that you have related to the plot. That tells us you cared. If it's relevant to one of the internals that has a message-based internal, use those. Look for all the different methods that there are on the field for telling us, because there are a lot of them. In the early days, we also used to say hunt the NPCs, but then we got better at understanding accessibility and realized how difficult that is. So we don't tend to do nearly as much plot anymore where the NPC will be wandering and you're just expected to find them. They usually have much better guidance on where they're going and who they're looking for, and we use that loop to do that.
Conclave as well, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, I mean, I do occasionally write plots where, when I sort of refer to broadband plots, I mean plots where they're out there and they have some specifics, but they're not targeted. But I think something and sometimes this is a misconception I think have players have, is that we have, I mean, I have quite a lot of friends who play, so I talk to them, so I get an image of some tiny slice of the field, and that's the same for all of us. But by and large, we don't know what's happening on the field. We have no way of knowing. All we can see are the signals you give, and that's via our debriefs via our plot NPCs, or via or kind of talking and meetings with civil servants or egregores, or via things. And obviously, when you pass a synod motion, especially with a greater majority in the appropriate assembly, that has a real effect on the icy NPCs in the world. But even if you pass a synod motion and it doesn't go anywhere and it has no direct game effect, but it's still useful for me as a plot writer to know that there's this player tried to get hitting people with big sticks made a virtue, but that didn't pass. But it's interesting that they wanted to do that, and then so maybe I'll remember that, and maybe when I'm writing a plot about hitting with big stick cultists, I might look towards that player. So you've got to think about like what, as plot writers, we can only do stuff with the information that we're given.
Yeah. And we can, going back to sort of the original question, I mean, I think at the last event, E4, did we have about 15 members of NPC crew present? Can the rest of you
Sounds
remember?
about right.
Yeah, which
sometimes it's more than that, but not hugely more.
Some of whom are disabled, so we're limited to an extent in what we can do with them. Like, I can't send like 40 people or 40 angry diplomats from different nations to come and stand around the Senate, because I don't have 40 different NPCs to brief up as diplomats from different nations. And again, like, I can't. One of the other reasons we don't tend to send people just walking around the field aimlessly for a long time is because our NPCs walk miles and miles and miles around that field. So we need to look after their health too.
Yeah, I mean, it's why we, Wind of Fortune, I think, have been amazing, right? Because then we can sort of basically say in those, an NPC will be out at this kind of time in this location, more or less. I mean, and obviously, I mean, you've got we mentioned talking to egregores before or finding NPCs, but remember, of course, these are characters that exist in the game. You can't go to everyone and go, these are the plots I'm interested in. But just you have to be aware that when you talk to an egregore, that does go somewhere. I will say we do have the skirmish team who are NPCs. They're not plot NPCs. They mostly do an NPC business of fighting, but they are committed role players as well. A lot, they do a lot of hard work, effectively role playing the different barbarian nations, and they're very good at that. And actually, although because they're not expected as part of their role to have a kind of full command of the setting in the way that plot NPCs are expected as, so it would be kind of unreasonable for them to expect to just drop into stuff. Absolutely, they are a resource that we pull on sometimes. So if we wanted them, if I wanted a mob, I'd probably talk to Big Andy, who runs Skirmish, and be like, Andy, I need a mob. Can you hit me up?
I mean, something. Someone did something really simple when we sent in a Yatoon warband filled with skirmish crew into the last event when they went to demand the Wereguild.
I've certainly had some success running quests with skirmish crew on them that are not traditional skirmish quests, and sort of trips through people's memories and vision quests and things like that. Basically, if we want a large number of people, we have to go to skirmish crew. Okay, so
yeah.
asks.
Is it worth mentioning? No, maybe a different one. I was just thinking about the team who run the experience tents, who are themselves like almost a separate team and have their own, and you could do stuff with it anyway. But I think that's not relevant to this right now.
Okay, not a question, but somebody just said in the chat the singing Jotun warband was amazing. So whoever's responsible for that, slap on the back. Yeah, Tim Baker asks, when someone's talking about a plot you wrote, how do you cope with having to keep quiet and not correct any grievous misunderstandings?
Poorly.
Is that a thing that you've encountered?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but it's actually
Yeah.
really easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you
okay.
just
I mean,
smile seriously, I suppose, but it can be tricky, for me at least, to not, you really don't want to you want to froth with them about it, but you also, and I love, as a plot writer, it's very much a pleasure hearing people, seeing people talk about the plot that you've written. I'm sure my colleagues feel the same, but you also don't want to be like, oh, actually, or you really completely misinterpreted that, because, and that is an important reason, not only because it was kind of spoil it, but actually because I believe that plot is a mutual creative endeavor between us and the players, and how they experience and interpret what we have done is part of the experience. So we actually damage the plot and damage its integrity by directing its experience externally. I mean, that's my particular perspective. I appreciate that might not be shared, but
yeah, totally agree. I mean, it can be tricky. But basically, I just have to smile and say, yeah, that sounds really cool. And not give any more detail.
That sounds fascinating.
I quite enjoy listening when there's been misinterpretations, where things have got twisted on the field from how they very clearly went out, because that can give a nice scope for pushing the story off in a brand new direction. Yeah.
But if you're familiar with the 3 times redundancy of tabletop design, magnify that for 2,000 people. And think about the level of redundancy we'd need to build into things if we actually expected people to interpret them the way we intended in the first place. So you just never expect anything to be actually interpreted the way you intended, because you can't with 2,000 people. So you have to learn that really early on. Otherwise, it just gets super frustrating.
Yeah, although I do try personally to not, like, if someone has a misconception about the plot, I will almost certainly never change it to sort of match that misconception, if you see what I mean. I mean, it might direct kind of what happens to a degree, but like I don't, what is with Empire, to a large degree.
Like if I was to write a plot about orange sellers and someone was like, oh yeah, fantastic, we're going to buy all these apples, I wouldn't change them to be apple sellers, but I might send in some apple sellers who are like, okay, cool, we're going to take advantage of this now. Yeah.
So, the same with if I put in a plot where I put in some kind, goodly orange sellers to refresh the player base, for example, but rumours started flying around that these were evil double agents. I might then, having listened to those rumours, think, the players seem really interested in this, maybe I will. Maybe I'll just leave them as like poor misunderstood orange sellers. Who knows?
Yes, but I'll know that for another plot, there's a super interest in double agents, so that I should think about putting that back there. So it's take one lesson from one thing and move it to something else. That's fun.
As Kat said, actually, I find it that there are some lessons to be drawn if you ever run tabletop from running it on a larger scale, or indeed run smaller LARPs. It's just that they don't always scale well. You have to learn different lessons. I mean, running a 2,000 person LARP or helping to write plot for a 2,000 person LARP is just it's completely different to writing for a 200 person LARP, which is itself from a 20. Like, scale changes it matters so much. And I think sometimes as a player, you experience the game on a relatively, you have you and your group, and everyone else is kind of obviously there, but actually the system that our players doing things and existing with the world and being authentic characters, the emergence behavior that you get from that is it produces just different stuff and misconceptions and conceptions and ideas, and you can't really, you have to learn that over time. I mean, I'm a better plot writer now than I was when I started as a result of making mistakes, I guess.
That responding thing stuff picks up a question that somebody was asking, trying to reframe the backgrounds question they were asking. The answer about how fast those responses come in, like, is it possible for somebody to witness something in the morning, have spoken to an NPC and have an NPC out in the field mentioning it by the evening? Yes, absolutely. But it's really hard to give you a steer on which plots that will happen for and which they won't, because it really depends on how many times the plot writer has decided that set of characters are going to be in Anvil over the weekend, and that won't usually change in response to player action. Whether you're able to talk to them will change what those NPCs do if they're already scheduled in to be out there 4 times.
Yeah.
But it'd be quite unusual for us to send them an extra time.
There's a practical thing, I think. But
yeah, go ahead.
Go on.
I was going to say, by Saturday afternoon, most of our NPCs are booked into roles through till about midnight when they're going to clock off. And we have very few sort of floating people generally that we can just grab and go, oh, I need you to go out and respond to something this player said this lunchtime. So it'll become maybe a next day, most likely a next event kind of issue, just because we don't have that giant, like, unending pool of NPCs to just call from. They're busy doing other stuff for other people.
I will say that, and this is a misconception. I think this has mostly gone from the player base now, but a misconception people used to have is that, you know, there were like teleporting portals in Empire. This isn't the case, apart from the Sentinel Gate, which is very specific and some very specific stuff. When if you have an NPC who comes from, I don't know, the village of Little Whizzing on the Hay, that is days away. So if some people come to you with a problem, or indeed you go through the Sentinel Gate to visit them, and like they can't, it's very unlikely because of the way the Sentinel Gate works that they could come back through. Or if they've come from their village, you've given them a response, there's no way they could go back. So if they're a mundane or if they're a foreign dignitary, they can't go back to their country or do it. Maybe they can send a message, but that has some IC costs, so they won't just do that willy-nilly. So if you think about what's going on IC, it can be hard for them to do that. Now, of course, what you can do, what we can do sometimes, if I'm wanting to send up a follow-up for an NPC that there and then, I might send a winged messenger, which NPCs can do. And indeed, you could send one to them. So if you send a winged messenger for an NPC you met on the field on Friday, I could get that, and I can write a response in the voice of that NPC, and then maybe you'll get that, maybe, although not always, because we don't always check during events. The flip side of this is that the NPCs I find easier to send out personally, again, if the logistical scheduling things line up, which is, as people have said, often they don't, are heralds, because I see it is physically possible for them to go back to their realm and to their eternal and go back out again. That is a thing that they can do. And so and sometimes I think people don't consider this as a thing in the world, even though it's something I think about a lot, right? So I think about when an NPC leaves the field, where are they going? Well, if they're a herald, then they leave the field through the Sentinel Gate, through the Regio Hall of Worlds back into the realms. They are going to a physically different kind of place than walking off the field to Greater Anvil and a tent IC somewhere, right? That even though from your point of view as a player, that NPC has gone, in character 2 different things are happening. And so something that I think it helps to think about, and one thing I try to do in my plots is make sure that reality of the world is reflected. I think that can, because then it feels authentic.
If you happen to run into an NPC that gives you an address that's called the Travelling Camp outside Anvil, that tends to mean I'm hoping that you will discover something during the event, cold wing messenger it, and we will be able to react quickly, because that means I've deliberately left my NPCs nearby so they can come back to you. That's a personal technique. I don't know whether anyone else is doing that, but it does turn up.
No, I think we've recently written a page on Anvil and given a name to that kind of greater Anvil area, which is actually really useful because I hadn't heard your name for it there, but yeah, that's exactly really good, right? You know where to send. There is a place that an NPC who is hanging around will be. It's the same place your character goes when they're camping IC, but you're camping OC.
Yeah, but if your winged message you get is far away, then that's a good indication that you're on a plot that's an event by event basis, not a many interactions in a day. And that's unusual in FestLab as well. Empire's timetable of which the plots change and respond to you is definitely slower than a lot of the other fests, so it can be an unusual experience for people.
And I guess
Yeah,
that's because the plot isn't the central thrust of
The game, yeah.
the game. It's
As I say, I think that ties in, like, the idea that plot's not the central thrust of the game, into one of the questions that we've got given by Welsh Wonder 92, saying, like, what advice would you give to players who really want to get stuck into the plot but don't know how? Which, like, for me, is to create the story that you want to see, start getting it playing out on the field. Like, I come from a background, I'm a wheelchair user, so as Dave can attest, as he used to be my egregore when I was a player, I'd spend a lot of time stuck in one spot in the field, not being able to go out and chase things, not being able to go to the skirmish, not being able to get to other places. So I'd spend a lot of time trying to grab hold of people and use the power of role play, as it were, to create stories which would eventually bloom and start getting back to other people, and I'd start getting, like, more response from them.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think there's a question about like I don't think I could play Empire to play the plot, and indeed we call ourselves, we say, yeah, it's interesting because Matt makes a distinction. I know other people who make the distinction the flip way around. So I'm not sure it's ideal, but Matt says, well, we do plot, but we don't do story. Or what does he mean by that? Because that's a confusing thing to say. I think what it means is that I see my role as a plot writer is to cause events and occurrences and experiences and all of this to happen in the world, but it's not like you're not trying to read a book. I'm not trying to just sort of tell you a story and you sort of sit there for it. It's not meant to be a passive thing. They're meant to be things that provoke your character. But the thing that matters for me, and I hope matters to most people, is the story your character tells in the world. And the best way of doing that in Empire is to interact with other players, and they will have stuff that they're interested in and that kind of thing. So I mean, personally, I think one of the best ways of getting involved with Empire is to as Emma was saying, kind of make those connections with other players and just create stuff and tell stuff, and then it generates up. If you really are quite interested in some of the unique stuff that you can get from plot, and obviously there are some stuff where kind of elements can come in from plot which don't come from elsewhere. One way of doing that are things like getting involved with Imperial organizations or Imperial hats, or some of the ways we've already talked about flagging interest in areas, and those do and can and have worked. But I almost think the question has a sort of misconception or a slight, it's hard to just follow plot at Empire, I think.
Yeah, we're creating a world that we want you to react to, and the reaction, that's the story. You read something in the Winds of War that your character hates, instead of sitting on it, take it and run with it. Take it to the priest, take it to the senators, make a big thing of it. If they're ignoring you, make a big thing of the fact they're ignoring you, build something that way.
And we do know that approach requires a little bit of confidence, is easier if you've got friends and contacts. And so we try a couple of ways of hooking plots to people for whom that's not true. And that's usually we use the Winds of Fortune as the main distribution method, but we'll ask the egregores to talk about it as well. And they will be essentially, they'll be sign your name up here plots. And that, if they're mine, that's literally go and drop your name in the box in the Hall of Worlds for reason X, and the Wind of Fortune will explain reason X. But even if they're not quite that point and click, they will be there'll be a narrative that is clearly flagged up as, here's something that would be great for new people to get involved with. And some of those get really high take up, and some of them, years back I did a competition for the Magician Maraud, and it had almost no entrants. Now the thing about all of those is they do look a little bit clunky to start with. They are clunky because they're particularly designed to say, hey, I'm over here and plot, and therefore they are just a thing. But they're a chance for you to know that you'll get in touch with an NPC, you'll chat to an NPC, you'll discover if there's a synergy or a connection, and that can lead to further plot. So there are a handful of different things like that that we're creating to try and make it easier for people for whom the instruction just role play harder is not helpful.
Well, indeed, just role playing harder doesn't, I think, actually work. You can role play very hard and plot. There's something slightly more alchemical that I don't really understand. I'm not sure I was very good at finding plot when I was a player. The other thing I would say is that Winged Messenger, which is, if you don't know, is an autumn magic ritual that's relatively cheap to cast as rituals go. It is a way of contacting NPCs. Now, often NPCs flagged in plots will have, and if you can contact a Winged Messenger, and I think we're even putting symbols in now to sort of flag that off at some point. I think there was certainly a plan to do that. Like that is literally us going, this is a lever right here. If you want to push this forward, if you want to signify, hey, I am interested in this thing, then reach out to that thing. And you don't need to be an automate to do that. You can maybe find someone to do it, and that can be challenging, but it is something that's available to you. And that's very much what I encourage to do. I think the invention of Wind of Fortunes in Empire has actually completely transformed and continues to transform how we run plot in the game, because as Kat says, we're really trying to make it as much as, there's a lot of plot that doesn't get in the Wind of Fortunes, I would say, but a lot of the stuff where there's a real clear way to interface with it is there. It doesn't mean you have to read all the Winds of Fortune, and we're trying to get better at flagging up, this is the Wind of Fortune that you should try to read if this is kind of what you care about. And that's something we continue to develop and improve on, because we don't do it perfectly by any means. But that I think they are very powerful.
Okay. Question has just come in. They say, what are your thoughts about the sort of things that get sent via plenipotentiary? I'm curious what happens after that letter gets delivered to you folks. Okay. So I'll say first up, nowadays those tend to get discussed between me, Andy, and Matt early on. We have a think about how we might respond to them before we start kicking them out. But I know you did quite a lot of them as well, Renna. So I don't know if you want to.
Well, I was doing a lot of plenipotentiaries
at all.
But I think this is sort of, I think your role that you've kind of taken on now means that like I'm doing less of what I was doing, because I was sort of doing what you were doing. But like, yeah, so the difficult thing with plenipotentiaries is they kind of straddle this campaign versus plot thing. And there's some real consistency things and stuff where it needs people like Matt and Andy to give guidance over what can happen, what can't happen. I think Andy has some quite clear opinions about what can come out of those. So that can never really be something that, but often, what I enjoy doing, and that is the kind of stuff that can still happen, is being given a brief that is, okay, we've decided that as a result of this plenipotentiary, this is the kind of thing we want to run, and then I'll hook onto it and go for it. So for instance, and I think this is a plot that has run and that continues to have ramifications, but I'm happy talking about it. A while ago, there was a plenipotentiary asking to talk to Skaith. I shan't say what the details were in that letter because that's completely private, but it caused an encounter with Skaith that was public in the Wind of Fortune. As a result of occurrences that happened in that encounter that I'd picked on essentially just because they needed someone to run the thing, I had an idea to kind of pick up some thread with that, fold in some other stuff we were doing, and that resulted in a succession of events that eventually, as you may have heard, led to all the mirrors in Starvos being shattered. But that happened actually just because, not because I definitely knew that's where I wanted to end, but actually because Andy had essentially had this kind of conversation with Matt and would now be with you, Dave, had said, oh, this is kind of what we want to do with Skaith. But that's very much a bare bones thing. Renna, can you take it, or does anyone want to take this away and expand it? And that's often how we do stuff. And Kat will have some amazing idea for a particular experience, and she does at least one amazing Plenipotentiary event, I would say. And then various people will take up other stuff too. But often you don't know. Yeah, there's this process by which, having taken that then brief, you then as a writer expand that out, and then it becomes yours and you own it after it's got that, and there's that kind of creative dialectic between you and Andy and Matt. Well, they have ultimate kind of creative veto, but you have a lot of control and passion, and you can shape it quite a lot. And yeah, and actually, I love, as a plot writer, actually what I absolutely love the most is being given a vague brief, being told there's some people who kind of already care about this, and then making it my own. Absolutely love it, adore it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say Plenipotentiary is quite good in that it's one of a few very specific ways that players can tell us we're interested in a plot about X. In this case, it's we want a plot about this Eternal, and this is the direction that we would like to take it in character, and then it's up to the plot team to respond to that. Plot team and the campaign team to respond to that in a way that creates an interesting story that engages players. And what I will just say, I don't know if there's anybody on this who puts Plenipotentiaries in. I think Andy's written something up about it more recently, but just as a really basic thing, it's good to be specific about what you're asking. There's no need to be vague because it's private. So some Plenipotentiaries that just say we should talk, because it's very difficult for us to work out what to do with that. And you'll probably end up getting a plot that was not really what you wanted.
Well, if you're like, I would like to make a deal to betray the Empire, shove it in there. You might not get
Exactly.
it, but then we know.
Yeah.
Then we know, and more so, we're more likely to offer you the kind of Plenipotentiary experience where that's relatively possible, rather than relevant. A massive open to everybody experience. Or it's much easier to shape an interesting Plenipotentiary, decide whether it should be one in the Hall of the Worlds or whether it should be one in an encounter tent with a smaller number of people. All of that becomes much easier the more information there is in the request.
Okay, so question that's just come through, or well, we've got a few questions coming through. Where do you draw inspiration from? Is there anything that might sound strange and unusual, seemingly having little to do with Empire at first, but helps get the creative brain juice bubbling? Does anybody want to talk about what makes their brain juice bubble?
I binge watch every TV show that I can find. And so what I tend to do is, for my plot, I desperately want people to have conflict. So any instance of conflict in any media is an example for me to steal and push into the game for the participants. So if I'm watching something or listening to a musical or something, it's a high chance that that'll make it in some way or another.
So there's a thread of stuff that, for me, that comes via the theatre company Punch Drunk in a very, very roundabout way. It turns up first in the God audiences in Odyssey, and then it turns up as PLV, Past Life Visions, in the encounter tents in Empire early on. But it's something that I think informs a lot of our small experience design. It's how do we create intensity? And that's what I'm looking for for interest in. How do I create intensity? We ran a bunch of Chimus performance experiences in Pitch Blackness for two reasons. One, intensity, and two, trying to remove one type of performance anxiety that tends to dominate Empire events, which is having to be seen. So that's inspiration for me. Another big set of inspiration for me is when people tell me I'm doing things badly, and they're right. So a huge amount of the inspiration from the encounters I have run over the last year have been, how the fuck do we make it accessible to go through the Sentinel Gate? Hey, what about charisma and non-physical disabilities and disabilities that expect the speed of your thought as a barrier to access? Does every puzzle have to be a really difficult puzzle, or is that something that is attacking that is a barrier for people with learning disabilities of certain types to participate. So trying to rethink different ways around all those different angles of things completely changes how I write. Not necessarily successfully is one of the other things to add, is that the correction that I might make or the new direction I go in won't necessarily have solved the problem, but I love trying to solve the problem in the process.
So, Emma, did you want to go, or?
I'm sure. Like I look for I'm generally rather uninspired when it comes to these things. There's no great stories that I particularly want to tell. What I want to do is make the world in which like the players are inhabiting seem a bit more real and more magical. So I like to focus a lot on nations and perhaps groups within nations that maybe haven't been getting as much attention from us. When I say groups, I don't mean your player group. I might mean, oh, do you know what? There's not been much out that's really like given the Brass Coast priesthood something to get into. And I will try and think of, like, for me, it's like solving a little puzzle, trying to work out a lot of different ways that I could give those players a good experience, remind them they're part of the game, and allow them to spread a bit more magic throughout the player base. I do that a lot using sort of like the half magic. The half magic pages are one of my biggest inspirations for that.
So I guess my first answer to this is people in the real world. And that to me is quite central to how I write plot or play characters. Anything is a sort of a fundamental belief that conscious beings are conscious beings. So I mean, Andy gets quite annoyed because me and Matt in plot meetings will just start talking about real world politics. But often, why does that happen? Because I like to understand people. I mean, so for instance, I wrote, I've done a lot of work over the years now on false virtues, and one which has appeared in plays, I'm happy to mention, is hatred. Which I mean, and everyone who reads the hatred auras, and you know, maybe you'll get a chance at some point if you're playing, says things like, "Well, they just make me feel a bit dirty." Well, the reason they do that is because they are almost explicitly fascist. Like that is a theme. And we were writing it originally, I think, around the time that Donald Trump was getting elected, which probably tells you kind of what I was thinking, right? So I was thinking about the psychology of why of difference and of rejection of difference, and that real world phenomena, and working out how that would work in Empire. I mean, Empire is a magical setting in which people can, you know, make gas come out of the ground and kill people and like make giant lions appear, and you know, there's all these weird and wonderful things, but it's still populated by people who act like people. And in some sense, I like to approach plots from that way and take inspiration from real world stuff, not in a cheesy ripped from the headlines way, and I think that can be very crass. But just as sort of I try to use what I know about the real world and apply it to this fantasy world. The other thing too is that I just have a deep familiarity with kind of tropes. I mean, I think something that, so Odyssey, for instance, which was one of PD's previous games, one of the things that did really well, because it was set in the mythic world, and kind of it took us read that anyone playing Odyssey probably at least had a passing familiarity with Greek myths or kind of pop cultural stuff, and maybe even knew a bit more. You could sort of evoke tropes from those myths, and you didn't have to explain all the details because you got those for free. And Empire kind of does this too, right? I mean, there's some ways in which it completely subverts normal fantasy expectations, but I think if you can play on tropes that people understand, and then you can subvert them or roll them or whatever, but as long as you're kind of plugging into a kind of collective narrative understanding that we have, and this is true in all creative stuff, but I think it's especially effective in LARP, where you don't necessarily have the time or the personal attention or the space to sort of fill in all those details. That can be really effective. So, you know, talking about that Scathed plot from before, again, I shan't mention the details, but, you know, that was very much inspired by the Snow Queen, which is one of the kind of classic fairy tales and some of the stuff around that. And there's this notion in this of a mirror where it burrows shards in your heart, and I use that for another plot at some point, which was Scathed impacted. And so I read a lot. I read a lot as a kid as well, and so you bring these stories in and you tell them and you retell them and you fold stuff in and you cross mix, and a really good plot and a really good encounter and a really good role playing experience sort of feels natural. It feels like, oh yeah, I know, I can yeah, this is evoking something that I'm not consciously aware of, a general understanding that I have. Now, I think the thing there is that, of course, there isn't one cultural understanding that people have when they come to when they play Empire, and so you need to make sure you're getting a big diversity of stuff you're evoking and seeing what's working and what doesn't. You've got to be conscious that not everyone is coming to the game with your own experiences, and that's why it's important to sort of workshop your plots and make sure that they actually do that thing. But that's certainly, I think, where I come from. Dave, did you
Okay.
wanna-
I've got a question here from an anonymous Twitch user, specifically for Stephen Kirkbride. It says, which is better inspiration for plot, Star Wars, Star Trek, or Babylon 5?
I'm going to field this one. I've never seen Babylon 5. I've seen 3 episodes of Star Trek, and I've seen the 9 episodes of Star Wars. So by virtue of elimination, Star Wars is obviously superior. It's also
most.
better.
But
I like
we're
them.
also not
Oh,
we're not allowed to write plot based on Star Wars after. I think yeah.
Well,
So I actually think that
specifics there.
I would love to get into. I actually do think that Star Wars has a really good one. It's talking about how people's actions in the past have affected others, which is incredibly relevant to the Empire. We're constantly seeing about how like that it fell and now it's rising again. We're looking at the history of the Empire's interactions with the different foreign nations that we've got, with the different Eternals, and that's basically is Star Wars writ large.
It's also Babylon 5, but if you haven't bothered watching it,
Yeah, I think you know,
Yeah.
But,
plenty of that in Trek, mate.
yeah, but it's all Star. I don't know. They're on a boat or something. I don't really understand it. I don't really.
Oh,
let's not have a great geek credentials battle.
I would lose.
I think you've actually incidentally made a serious point there, which is that history is quite a good source of, and like themes of history are quite writ large, I think, in Empire, and themes of, I mean, not legacy, because actually that isn't so much a theme, and like bloodlines aren't really a thing that happen in Empire at all, as a sort of a core design thing. But certainly that idea that past actions can haunt you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Valorn is a very good example of that. I think. Like,
Empire mistakes were made.
Yeah, I mean, in a game where we burnt the libraries during world creation, and I say we, I didn't actually have anything to do with world creation at all, but we burnt the libraries so as not to have to make a fuss about history. We actually discovered that people love playing with uncovering history, and you really can't create a game setting this rich and not have that happen as part of what people want to do. So yeah.
I mean, basically, they thought they didn't want to write a game about history, and then they wrote a game which is, in my view, very much about history, and they were wrong, but that's okay. And
and we're managing.
We're managing. You know, I mean, I think, and I think it's interesting as well because, you know, I like historiography, like the study of history itself, and obviously, like, just to pick 2 nations, like Highgarden and Eredin have completely different understanding of really what history means or what it should mean, and like what its relationship to like piddling things like what actually happened should be, and that's really interesting. I mean, and in a game where you also have things like past life visions, there's some really interesting stuff you can play with there.
Okay, right. We're going to take a couple more questions, and before we wrap up. So, we were asked by Tim Baker, do you ever find that you cackle aloud while you're writing plot?
every single plot that I've ever written has caused me to cackle aloud at least once. It especially happens more when doing Winds of Fortune stuff. But yeah, anytime I'm writing a letter, I wrote a letter from a small child that was going to then Empress, and that just made me bust a gut. It was perfect.
Oh, I wrote a letter from a small child, and that also made me cackle. It's always good that when you're just sticking the emotional knife in. Yeah, I like to cackle when I write in plot. I like that feeling of yes. I would say that's a key emotion for me. But not everyone, I think.
not a solo cackler. I think I do more cackling when the NPC team come back and tell me what they've been
That's
doing than
true.
I do when I'm writing. I don't have that kind of bone in my body particularly.
Always happens to me during that process where you're chatting your potential plots through with Matt and Raph, and they start telling you how they hook into other bits of the world that you hadn't quite realised, and what was just like a nice little thing on its own becomes really rich and horrible for the players, and I love it. That's when I get mine.
Yeah, I don't think I really cackle to myself. No, I'm probably more likely to, as you say, cackle when there's other people around.
Oh yeah, I think I definitely agree with Kat. There's a different kind of cackling for me that happens when you're like, the NPC comes back and like, this is what the players said. I'm like, amazing, and there's a mutual shared joy at that. Not laughing, by the way, at what the players have done, but just we have recognised that what the choices they've made is going to just, this can run and run, and when something's really gone well, I think that's when you laugh. Cackling is different from. I never want to be laughing at players. That's a horrible emotion, right? But you want to be like, the joy of horrible things are going to happen or great things are going to happen. But this is going to run and run, and this is great.
Yeah, I think sometimes I may be laughing at myself because I'm thinking either, is this too abstract and no one's going to understand it, or is this going to be impossible to run? And then I'm sort of thinking, well, I'm going to do it anyway, so I may as well go with it.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, last question then. Nose Render asks, the Mountains of the Moon exploration was very cool. Are there any other areas of the world you hope the players explore next?
I know I've said, but do you mind if I start fielding this one? Because it's I wrote, if that's okay. Yeah.
Go ahead, Rena.
So I wrote all the Mountains of the Moon /Sark stuff. They were kind of my baby. So I'm really glad you enjoyed it. That feels really great to hear. Thank you. So I think the interesting thing is we hadn't actually defined all the details about that in advance. I mean, we sort of, there is a larger world map than the players have access to, but on that, when I came to it, because we knew we were going to need to put some stuff there due to the various stuff that I can't talk about, mechanics that were happening in the world, we knew that was going to be relevant at some point, so we're going to have to start the development work on it, and that's probably where, and then approximately then was when it started dropping in that you might be able to explore this area. The area wasn't very sketched out, and then we had to still do more work on it, and that's kind of, it's a bit like a fog of war thing, right? We don't want to write more content than you've explored. It's not like there are whole other places that we've pre-written waiting for you to find. So I think what I would say is there's a lot to explore within the Empire even, I think always pushing outwards, it's kind of, it's not like we've predefined it, and therefore I'm really hoping you find out that in the Vor there's a gigantic legion of apple wizards or whatever, it's
yeah, that's not what the game's about.
No, exactly. It's nice
not about expansion and more places being revealed.
I mean, the mountain. And why are the Mountains of the Moon in there? Well, partially they're in there because, as I think the players are now aware, this is a group of people who apparently have a big pile of resources, maybe not so much in the way of armies, but good defenses. And there's some clear pressing problems for the players about what you might do about that, because you might decide to, you're an empire, why don't we do a bit of empire building? Or maybe we don't think that's the right thing to do. But always the reflection is back on the Empire, because it's a game about the Empire.
Really good way to look at it, actually. The only reason for us to reveal any new areas is to ask the Empire what it thinks about them, not to open up another kind of thing to be playing with. It's to give the Empire a new set of choices.
I really enjoy the Mountains of the Moon, and I think that they're more than So obviously, anything that we do in terms of plot is simply so that players can react to things and have conflict on the field. But I think having stuff in there so that characters can push, because like their choice to go and exterminate the Druge, for example, is because of stuff that's been written. And I personally am really looking forward to experiencing the Malum in full. But I still think that will be the Empire. And I think that, yeah, for me, it's the Malum anyway, in direct response to that question.
I'm quite
Yeah,
excited to
there's-
see the Malum. Actually, it's going to be. I don't really know what it's like other than it's a bad time. Unlike Hordalord, which was like, oh, farms, quite nice.
Well, it's not Otkadov, which is the nicest thing, obviously. Let's just be fair. But no, yeah, I'm not saying the Malum because we've hidden 17 different spider temples. You need to get a single thing from each one of them and then create a giant magic sword.
No.
I think the Malum because of the stories that it'll create and the choices it'll force.
Another reason I like setting development, which you can't do all. I mean, I like it, but you can't do it all the time because it's not really what the game's about. But you can sort of stick hint. So, for instance, before I actually wrote the Mountains of the Moon, and the players don't still maybe know everything that's going on there, so I shan't say much. But before I wrote it, I had chosen to sort of seed in little things for a while before. And that's one of the, and we're constantly doing. I certainly am constantly doing in stuff I write. I try to think. Yeah, there's plots which I think I might not write for years, but I have put little snippets of information about them, but they aren't necessarily already coherent or a coherent whole in the game. And so at some point, I will start pulling those threads back together and drawing them together. There is stuff in the world that like players might never put together, and that's okay. And that's good too. That's just part of the thing. But I think it's part of making a rich, detailed, real world is having those things in there. And so I think that is one of the joys of setting creation, and this happens temporally as well as spatially. History development as well as territory development is you get this sense of pulling strands and writing hints, and then if people go towards it, then maybe you make it more coherent.
But it's
But
also
You're planting a guard.
it's also important that it's not a thing all plot writers do.
No,
Being on
Yeah.
the plot team at Empire does not mean you get to write setting. That's
no, absolutely not.
a different
Yeah.
set of roles,
Yeah.
and Stephen and Renna have them. I'm not sure who else does at the moment, but the original setting writers, most of them either played or went on to do different things for a while. Very, very few of them moved straight from setting to plot.
Yeah, and indeed, I don't think of myself as a setting writer. I think of myself as a plot writer. But sometimes the right thing to do for a plot is to bring in new elements. But always the question that Andy will ask, for instance, is, does this need anything new? And indeed, we really try to avoid newness because we have so much. I mean, the Empire where he is massive. It's always a challenge to just write about the stuff we already have. We don't. There's so much of it, and we really would want to make that as rich as possible. But Empire is also a point of light setting, right? There's large areas of territories where we don't necessarily say, "Oh, this is what's here," because the Empire has like maps, but maybe it doesn't mean you know every little village. You don't know everything happening. The Empire has stuff that happens within its own borders it doesn't know or understand, and that's in some sense that we are plot writers are creatures of the gaps. We crawl like out of the little crevices where you don't know what's going on, and then suddenly we're there. Throwing apple wizards at you, you'll never find out all the crevices. There'll always be more apple wizards, and that's kind of the joy of the game. So we're never going to be like, secretly there's a cult on that's definitely there at Castanea, but you never on Anvil, but you've never seen it because that's the Timing world. That's the world you completely understand. But then there's a shadow world and bits of the Empire doesn't know, and that's where plot comes from for me.
Yeah, like for all, like as a player, I think I'd be interested in exploring outside of the world. As a plot writer, I am far more interested in the soap opera dynamics of two competing landlords throwing bigger silly curses at each other and creating problems for themselves, their nation, and the empire as a whole as a result of it, than I am some weird folks coming in from Octave or something. Like, that's where my joy is. And when I read players' froth posts, that's where their joy is at the end of the events too. That's what everybody, when you look through, it's the personal interactions people remember and treasure most. And those are what I want to, and I think a lot of us want to try and build and provide opportunities for you to have those.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally am quite interested in players exploring the existing barbarian nations that we've got as people as well, and sort of causing us to have to elaborate a little bit more on their cultures and how they actually exist in the world.
Yep.
Well,
So that's
luckily,
something I
have you
like to do.
heard? There's a peace treaty with the Grenville. So,
Well, that's very interesting, Stephen.
what are the odds, right?
Yeah, I do love all the foreign nations and the barbarian nations for that, for your ability to sort of work out how they live their lives. I think whenever I write any NPC, wherever they're from in the world, maybe not so much if they're herald, but still in I sort of think, what does an average day in the life of this person look like?
What did they have for breakfast?
Right.
Yeah. So I think we've been on video chat for quite a while now, and we're probably all getting quite tired. But thank you all very much for your time.